Hi everybody, I'm Heather Campbell, the CEO of Bush Heritage Australia, and welcome to our webinar where we're going to share a year of impact. I'd like to hand over now to Chris Grubb, who's our president. Chris has been on our board for 9 years, but I know he's been involved with the organisation for a lot longer than that. And I think it's 11 years that he's been involved with helping us from a marketing and fundraising committee. And he and his wife Gina have been a huge support to us. And I've felt really privileged as coming in as a new CEO to Bush Heritage to have that guidance, that support, and experience the joy through Chris and Gina's eyes. I will have very fond memories of sitting around a freezing cold Nari night looking at shooting stars, but listening to stories around a campfire. Or Chris getting me up early in the morning to hunt for birds in Warrnambool country in the Kimberley, and seeing that joy of seeing something new that he hadn't seen before. Needless to say, I am still a work in progress from a bird perspective, but Chris has so much knowledge about birds and I am learning so much. So please welcome Chris Grubb to share his reflections as we share our impact report.
Thank you, Heather, and good evening. I would like firstly to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. As Heather has said, this is my final year as president, so I appreciate the opportunity to thank you, our Bush Heritage community, for supporting our efforts on your behalf and to briefly reflect on Bush Heritage at the completion of my 9 years on the board. We at Bush Heritage have always regarded our supporters and partners as a community of common interests, and tonight's audience wonderfully reflects this. Amongst our 120 attendees tonight, we have bequestors, volunteers, new supporters, corporate supporters, regular donors, board members and staff. A very warm welcome to you all. So why are we all supporters of Bush Heritage, giving freely of our time, money, and a commitment to this organisation? Well, for me, it's because Bush Heritage is a good news story in conservation. I attended a Bush Heritage Australia briefing some 20 years ago and was struck by several things. The need for such an organisation, firstly. The values and dedication of the Bush Heritage team. Our science-dictated decisions, but above all, at the compelling evidence of species and habitat recovery from their on-the-ground work. They clearly made a difference. Well, now 29 years on, from Bob Brown's first $50,000 in 1992, we've invested roughly $170 million to date in protecting Australia's precious environmental heritage. $170 million. The vast majority of this funding has come from private sector supporters like yourselves online tonight. We deployed $8 million in our first 10 years. We deployed $46 million in our next 10 years. And we will invest over $100 million on conservation in the current 10-year period. So we are making a difference, and on a scale that matters. In fact, on over 11 million hectares, almost 2 Tasmanias in size. We aim to leverage your contributions, whether time or money or simply encouragement, for the benefit of future generations. We apply what we call right-way science by combining traditional owner knowledge of the land with modern science. Innovation and adaptive technology characterizes our work outside the fences, and Beck will comment on more on this later. We have worked particularly hard to measure our impact by introducing the Accounting for Nature certification standards at URADI into this year's impact report. We, like you, know that we need to analytically measure the value of our impact so that carbon sequestration, clean water, and flourishing ecosystems can prove that a healthy country, protected forever, adds to the health and well-being not just of nature, but of society too. So what gives me a buzz about Bush Heritage? Well, it is experiences like watching frogs emerge from under the sand when it unexpectedly rained in the Simpson Desert, marveling at a healthy 500-year-old coolabah tree, which had adapted to fires, floods, insect invasions, and droughts, passing this genetic learning on to its nearby offspring for their next 500 years. Finding an orchid species at Nardo Hills Reserve, declared extinct some 70 years previously. Seeing how life on Earth began some 3 million years ago with the stromatolites at Hamilton Station, and watching traditional owners foraging for bush tucker and telling moving stories of their connection to the land. With a global population now of some 7 billion, going on to 9 billion people, what will the quality of life be like if we don't protect these wonders of nature for future generations? Once we can reopen our reserves, we hope to share similar experiences with you. We will recover from COVID just like we recovered from the Spanish flu. But it was this time last year that the bushfire outbreak started in Queensland, and we haven't cured the causes of that disastrous season, nor will we in the short term. There is more work to do. However, Bush Heritage is up for this. As you are aware through your support, nature can respond to these challenges if given a chance. Bush Heritage Australia is about giving nature that chance, focused on protecting what we have and encouraging others to share this vision. The Bush Heritage team has garnered international recognition for its application of open standards for conservation, for its world-class partnership programs with traditional owners, for its right way approach to fire, for its pioneering work in Tasmania in farming partnerships. And now we are rehabilitating West Australian farmland with 1 million trees financed through carbon credits. These are just some of the examples of the legacy that I and you are leaving through your support of Bush Heritage. I would now like to hand over to the ever-energetic CEO, Heather Campbell.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for sharing that with us. I'd like to share now some of my stories and some of the highlights from this last year. The year of fantastic achievements, but also some pretty big challenges. So when we look at the map of Australia, we have this huge area that we operate across. We operate across 11.3 million hectares of land, which is equivalent to half the size of Victoria. Across our many partnerships, our 25 Aboriginal partnerships, and our partnerships with neighbours and farmers, and our 36 reserves. We also managed to store 45 million tonnes of carbon. Now that's a very large number, and I sometimes find it hard to get my head around it. But I had the team do some calculations, and that works out to be equivalent of what Melbourne and Sydney as cities emit for 15 years. So that's an amazing achievement, what we are protecting and holding and storing within those landscapes. For me, what has been great about this last year is all the conversations that I've had with many of you. The conversations with 117 staff, the 1,000 volunteers, and the almost 40,000 supporters. And being able to be out in the countryside and experience some of our reserves. And it makes it even more poignant given that I'm stuck on the outskirts of Melbourne now, not going anywhere. But some of the great memories for me are being able to sleep on the beach with the traditional owners of Kurrajurri, our newest partnership, which we signed last year. And they're about 3 hours south of Broome. To be able to be in that environment, fishing with them, and then them sharing their knowledge with me about the plants, their medicinal purposes, how they use them, and for me to start to learn and understand that connection to the land. I was also lucky enough to visit a number of our reserves, including Yorka in Queensland, which was very poignant given that I was up there one day looking out across a ridge to then have the call at Christmas time to say they were fighting a fierce fire there. Or to be down in the southwest of Western Australia, to be able to see the home of our small little honey possum, which was on the very first slide. Or the home of the amazing huntsman spiders, which was a story that went viral because of them all finding great homes in our nest boxes. So it has been a magical year of so many highlights and so many opportunities to be out there on country. And a huge thank you to all of you that make that possible. But it's also been a year of challenges. And one of those big ones was the Black Summer bushfires. So we had fires across 7 of our reserves, impacting over 25,000 hectares. The reserves that were most significantly impacted were Scottsdale and Burren. So Burren is about an hour east of Canberra, and that was one of the first to be burnt around that sort of November, December timeframe. And it was a hot fire that went through there and really intense. But I was there about 2 months after the fire went through, and you could see that green fuzz of epicormic growth. Saw the ferns coming back, started to hear the frogs, saw a couple of lyrebirds, saw wombat scat, so knew that the animals were starting to come back. But it has presented challenges for us. Challenges around feral cats, foxes, and particularly deer. We've put monitoring cameras out so we can understand how species are coming back and also those threats that we need to manage. And also it has been a challenge around weeds and them taking off after the fires. I'd also like to share what's happening at Scottsdale. So this is a picture of a shriveled up tree guard and what looks like a dead seedling. And unfortunately, fire impacted 70% of Scottsdale. And I remember that sinking feeling when I saw the big old gums that were so precious and how the fire had got into the bottom of them and burnt them out. And the team originally thought that we'd lost the 30,000 seedlings that we'd planted, and many of you had helped plant over the years. But we hadn't. What was fantastic when the volunteers got in there and pulled off the tree guards was to see that those seedlings were still alive at that ground level and to see them sprouting back to life. So we haven't lost them. We've sort of lost their tops, but they are coming back. And that's a really great recognition of the way the team plants there at Scottsdale, because they plant them so deep because of the conditions on the Monero. They've really helped them come back from fire. So we've got a lot of work to do, but we're so lucky that we've had the support of all of you and many major donors and supporters around the globe, which means it'll make it so much easier to, buckle down in the face of those challenges and actually do the work that we need to tip things back in favour of our native species and to get those reserves looking like they used to be and giving us all that sense of joy and achievement. I'd now like to pass over to Beck Spindler, who heads up our science and conservation team and is the guru of the group. And she's going to talk through some of the more detailed aspects of our impacts that we've had this last year. So Beck, over to you.
Many thanks, Heather, and hello everyone. Today I'm on Barma country and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I'd genuinely like to extend my heartfelt thanks to all the traditional owners of this entire region and really across Australia for their generosity and graciousness in sharing knowledge, cups of tea and a laugh with me and many of the other Bush Heritage staff on a regular basis. Great introductory stories from Heather and Chris, but enough about burrowing frogs and communal huntsmen. Now it's time for the graphs. So this is an impact presentation after all, and what would that be without a few graphs to report on our activities? It must be said that the things that take up most of the days of our on-ground staff are managing the threats to our species and habitats. Usually we summarise this as ferals, fire and weeds, but of course it also includes many threats that are out of our control and on a much broader landscape, including climate change, water availability, and of course the natural disasters like that we've seen this year with the extreme fire, but could also be flooding and environmental contamination. As a summary of our total reporting across the country, you can see on the left-hand side in the pie chart the status of all of the threats across every single one of our reserves as they sit this year. Of course, this summary is a mix of 1,000 success stories and things that need a little bit more attention. As you can see here, over 2/3 of the threats are at medium or low level, and that's generally what we consider acceptable and manageable. In contrast, the high and very high threats are the things that keep us up at night and where we usually focus with our colleagues and our partners to find new ways and new resources to work on these stubborn threats. It's all very well to know the absolute numbers and where we are at any one time, but it's actually important to know the impact that we've had as a result of our management since the ownership of our reserves, since we bought each of these different reserves. They're all at a different time, obviously. We've bought all of these reserves at different times, but that bar graph on the right-hand side tells you the change that we've been able to make through our management on ground. As you'll see, there has been significant progress made with 37% of the threats reducing over the time of ownership of every single one of our reserves. The bar graph on the right is where I'm talking about now. We have 39% that even in a year where much could be sliding south and we see that there's increasing threats all the way through, 39% of our threats are holding steady, and that's a win in my book. But we have seen 24% of those threats increase. Some of that increase is due to an influx of data from CSIRO, which has improved our understanding of climate change impacts across our reserves. And unfortunately, this has led to an upgrading of the assessment of some of our threats in some of these cases. But it is also due to the drought, which is being felt across most of Australia, a lot of Australia, and of course the bushfires that we saw this last season. I don't think anyone would argue with me that the beginning of 2020 has been a challenge. But despite increases in both the obvious and hidden threats to nature, we're still gaining ground. We've seen an overall reduction in the threats across our properties this year, and that's a great testament to the work of our reserve and partnership teams across the country, and of course to all the people that support them. The next part of the equation that we care most about, of course, is the end result of those management actions on ground and the conservation status of the species and habitats protect, which we call our conservation targets. This is a much more complex relationship and a much less direct one. There's often a lag between the time of dealing with threats on country and seeing a change in an improvement in the conservation targets that we have. But there's also a really complex mix of many threats coming in from outside of our reserves. But this is our bottom line, and we're always looking to see upward trends in all of our targets. This harsh year is showing up in the data on how our targets are going, just as it did in our threat data. The current condition of more than 50% of our targets is good or very good, which again, we consider acceptable and manageable. But that means we're still aiming much higher for over 40% of our conservation targets. And again, that's both species and habitat types. This makes sense when you remember that we buy not only large swathes of really important land in great condition, but we also prioritise landscapes that are threatened, and we focus on where bush heritage can help through restoration, reconnecting country, and bringing people and country back together to protect the cultural and conservation values of the landscape. We have made excellent progress. Again, with this year, 46% of our targets improving condition since we've taken over ownership of the land. And in a time where everything has the potential again to slide downhill, we've got 43% holding steady. 11% have worsened, and that is an increase over previous years. Again, partly due to those really severe droughts that we've been seeing the impacts of for many years, and to be honest, will take quite a few years for us to come out. It's also due to the bushfires, but there are many contributing factors to conservation and the potential decline in condition, as I was mentioning before. Many of these are at a scale that are outside of our direct land management control, and that's why we're working with neighbours, partners and colleagues on land, in government and in the universities to work across landscapes and design best practice land management across the country. Just as your bank balance is a blunt tool that indicates a progress towards a goal that is made up of many stories of both the ups and the downs, we've mentioned some of the challenges we faced this year that are starting to bring some of these indicators down, but now let me tell you some of the specific stories that have helped push these numbers in a positive direction. So in the north, things are definitely looking up for the Redfin Blue Eye. This inch-long, critically endangered fish only occurs on Bush Heritage's Edgbaston Reserve in nature, in central Queensland. In 2017, Bush Heritage started a breeding program with the support of the Queensland Government's Everyone's Environment grant to increase the size and conserve the genetic diversity of those wild populations. That included setting up 3 constructed springs on Edgbaston itself and the land of the Bidjara people to act as a breeding ground. Over the coming year, about 10% of the captive bred fish will be used to augment the wild populations, significantly reducing the risk for this tiny but mighty species. In the southeast, when our Karakara Wedderburn Reserve team on Dja Dja Wurrung country observed a tree die-off event on Nadu Hills, it became clear that a significant heat spell at the end of a really long dry period was likely the key trigger. This is a pattern that we now understand is predicted to continue through the coming decades on Nadu Hills, an overall warming and drying trend with some extreme rainfall events. I've mentioned the impacts of climate change a couple of times in our projections, and this project is a great example of our reserve teams observing the changes on ground, getting ahead of the curve, and acting to gather information on the likely successful mechanisms to mitigate the worst impacts of a drier, warmer environment. In 2019, one of our volunteers, Dr. Gary McDonald, led a collaborative project with one of the most intricate experimental designs I have ever seen to control for environmental factors as well as really testing the experimental variables. We planted over 9,000 grey box and yellow box seedlings that were nurtured from seeds collected from hotter, drier places, which are similar to what we think is predicted to be seen on Nadu Hills in the next 30 to 70 years timeframe. Over the coming decades, we'll track and compare the survival rates of the propagated plants with the expectation that plants from hotter, drier regions will cross-pollinate with local trees, produce increasingly genetically diverse woodland that is more resilient to the changing climate. I don't think I'm telling tales if I let out a tiny early secret that the early survival of some of our seedlings from the hottest and driest areas have actually done better in the early phases of recruitment. So at least these genetics have started to improve our recruitment, if not our overall survival and long-term propagation of these species. Over in the West, you will remember most likely reading about Uradi and our Million Trees project that Chris also mentioned. If you haven't read it, you can go back through any one of your bush tracks or potentially even the last impact report. This year, Uradi is the focus of our first environmental economic account. We know that healthy ecosystems provide many valuable services such as water decontamination, pollination, erosion control, and carbon sequestration. Yet these contributions to our economy are really often overlooked and therefore accidentally and unmitigatingly destroyed. With the support of the Ian Potter Foundation, Bush Heritage is feeding the data in our reporting framework into an environmental economic accounting method that maps the health of our natural assets against our goals for those assets and against a peer-reviewed definition of what pristine would look like. This is taking our reporting to the next level, and the added structure and benchmarking helps to prevent a shifting baseline and our understanding of what it is that we're ultimately aiming for. By engaging partners like Accounting for Nature, we're inviting added scrutiny that also means we'll be in a great position to take up a biodiversity market as that reaches Australia. We'll also be helping to develop the same kind of accounts for farms across Tasmania with the Midlands Conservation Fund, in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland with the help of grants and many partners. And like the Oscars, there are too many to name and I know I'll forget someone. So please have a look at that section in the impact report to see who we're working with. The last thing I wanted to take you into more depth is our science. In early 2020, our board approved taking a right-way science approach. We've borrowed the term right-way science from right-way fire. Some people will refer to this practice as two-way science. We've moved away from that name because we feel it emphasised the separation between one way of thinking and another way of thinking. It also left the impression that there are only two ways of thinking. Right-way science approach makes a conscious effort to establish and foster a respectful relationship that recognises Aboriginal culture and knowledge in all aspects of our work. Using right-way approach, we make a conscious effort to blend knowledge systems and multiple ways of thinking to more effectively achieve positive outcomes for people and country. Solomon O'Ryan, who's an ASRAC Senior Ranger, sums it up beautifully when he says right-way science is an approach to the practice of science that is based on respect, sharing knowledge, listening and learning. It blends different knowledge systems for the benefit of people and country. Right now, there are 65 research projects that are active across our reserves and partnerships, many in collaboration with traditional owners and university partners. These projects come up from the ground and are driven by reserve teams that identify a gap in knowledge that becomes a barrier to achieving the goals in our conservation plans. These gaps fall into the themes that you would expect a science plan in a conservation organisation like ours. This year, I'm thrilled to announce that Bush Heritage staff have published 22 peer-reviewed papers, which is even higher than our goals that we set for them, or we thought that was a stretch goal. Every one of these papers is fantastic, and they're all up on our website if you'd like to have a look at them and ask any questions of us. It's surprising how many of these papers focus on species, but that's largely, I think, because the species indicate the broader health of the landscapes where we work. One in particular, published by the Wonnerbagaambra, our Kimberley partners, focused on the benefits of prescribed burning, not only to carbon sequestration, but to the status of threatened mammals in the area. This is fantastic. It's one of the first papers I've really seen that goes in depth to understand the impact of prescribed burning, not just on carbon sequestration, but genuinely looking at the conservation benefits of it and making sure that we're not delivering adverse conservation outcomes by trying to sequester carbon. One final one I'd like to highlight is the work with Threatened Species Recovery Hub and the wonderful April Reside, which makes clear that we need to understand and identify current and future areas that will provide refuge for species. Aboriginal knowledge will be critical to understanding where refugia lie across Australia, and Bush Heritage is really looking forward to working together to build this knowledge. Bush Heritage is, after all, nature's refuge, and we need to work together to realise that and make sure that we're really protecting the most critical habitat. Just before I hand back over to Heather, I wanted to give my heartfelt thanks to all the Bush Heritage supporters who, despite everything 2020 has thrown at us, have stuck by us and continue to give us, to support us to undertake the work that we need to do on ground every day. From the supporters that have given us significant amounts to undertake large-scale work to acquire land and to really dig into infrastructure, to the stalwart regular supporters who give us the assurance and certainty that we can aim for the impossible while achieving the possible. After the bushfires, it was clearer to me than ever that the critical need of the work that we do, and I've been really grateful to have a chat with many supporters who've shared that sentiment with me. And finally, I'd like to add my thanks on behalf of all the staff to Heather and Chris. While 2020 has indeed been a scouring year, the overwhelming sentiment of Bush Heritage staff is gratitude for working for an organisation that not only manages finances incredibly well, but also cares so naturally about all of its staff. We are confident that we'll come through this together, as we have every other challenge that's been thrown at us, and we're grateful for your very strong, capable guiding hands.
Thanks, Beck, and I should start by saying a huge thank you to all the staff and our volunteers and our supporters. Without you, we couldn't do the work. And this is reflected in what an amazing year we've had when we look at the numbers of revenue and how we've spent that. This has been our biggest year yet. The donations and the gifts and support we've had has been phenomenal. You may be looking at these two graphs and going, oh, there's a bit of a difference between what you've brought in and what you've been able to fundraise and what you've spent. A lot of that relates to timing. As you'd appreciate, the Black Summer bushfires, they started at this time of the year and went all the way through to February. And it was through those summer bushfires that we had fantastic support from all over the globe. And we managed to get support of well over $2 million that came in from everywhere and from really unusual sources. And you may have seen some of our recent social media on some of that, where we were supported by Earth Alliance out of the US, VW out of Australia and Europe, and a range of individuals and other organisations that are supporting us. You'll notice on the graph in relationship to revenue that there's, donations and gifts are fairly self-explanatory. The volunteer services revenue, the accounting standards now allow us to recognise the time that our fantastic volunteers put into supporting us. So that then is now actually counted. And also in relationship to conservation enterprises revenue, that relates to things like some small amount of funds that we get from carbon and also some other innovative things that we are doing, and particularly in relationship to Hamlin Station Stay, where people come and enjoy that amazing reserve through being at the station stay, as well as things like bluegrass seed harvesting that we're doing in Queensland. In relationship to the expenses side, as you will see, the vast majority of our funds go to that conservation management work out in the field, and we're focusing on always trying to increase that percentage. But we also recognise a key role for us at Bush Heritage is about sharing the stories and being able to engage with people so that we share that love of nature and get even more people involved, which is why we spend a significant amount of our funds in events and education and supporting our supporters and getting them engaged. So happy to answer any questions that you may have in relationship to this, but just a huge thank you to everybody that has made it such a successful year and has set us up so well for going into this year with the challenges of what COVID might bring from a global recession perspective. So we are in good shape going into this year. Our teams are out there doing, as Beck said, fire, ferals and weeds, because as we know, they don't take holidays. So huge thank you to everybody that allows us to do that. We've now allowed about 15 minutes for question and answer, and we would love to have your questions. So there's been a couple of questions that I'll start off with from the chat box, so please keep them rolling in. So the first one, I think it's more for you, Beck, and you may have answered a bit with your story around Nauru Hills, but I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on how you assess the current state of Nauru Hills. So not just from the climate perspective, but what else we do to assess the current state.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Heather, and thank you very much. It's a great question. I don't have Nauru Hills numbers directly in front of me. I'm happy to give you more specific data in days to come. I have to say it's been a hard few years for Nauru. So what we do every few years, and it's scheduled every 5 years, collect sufficient data, analyse all of that data and put it together in an evaluation report. That's actually just been completed. So Dr. Matt Appleby, our ecologist for that area, has just completed the evaluation report for Nauru Hills. And that demonstrates very clearly that the drought has not been kind to Nauru Hills. Many of our targets have actually done okay. We've discovered new orchids. We've found new ways of protecting those orchids and some of the targets. But the larger landscapes have really suffered from the drought, from the lack of moisture and the really extreme heat periods that we've experienced over the last few years. So that would be one of the, probably on average, I would say Nauru would probably be one of the areas where we've definitely experienced heightened threats. We're doing well with management of all the threats that we have control over. We're doing well in terms of invasive species, but really the inability to control the access to water and rain, the inability to control rain across these landscapes is something that we just will never get away from. But it is a challenge that we're looking at. There's a wonderful woman, Suzanne Prober from CSIRO, has written a fantastic paper about the need to take a more active approach to management on conservation lands, and she calls it landscape renovation rather than restoration, not just putting back the same things that have been there all the time, but making sure they're really as resilient as they possibly can be and managing for the future instead of just what we see today. We're really taking that on and working with traditional owners and other partners in the area to figure out how we most effectively do that. Nauru Hills will be one of the areas that we focus on for this work.
Thanks, Beck. The next question I might take, it's a question from Gabriella, and she's asking how she can help with monitoring at Currumbin Valley, which is fantastic. So we'll reach out to you, Gabriella, with that particular reserve. But some of you may be wondering, well, how do I get involved as a volunteer? So we do have a volunteer section through the website, and that's how you sort of link into the opportunities. And we have volunteer coordinators around the different states that will send out, I suppose, invitations with the skill set we're looking for particular projects. As you'd appreciate at the moment, it's very hard for us to move volunteers across state boundaries. So we're really looking at people being able to volunteer within their state. So that's just one of the challenges at the moment. And please keep those questions flowing so that I can make sure I get up to them. The next one is sort of a question/statement in relationship to right-way politics. I think the thing that we would say here is that, you know, we deeply, deeply respect traditional owners, and we want to make sure that as we are engaged more with meeting with, you know, politicians and the broader sector, that we are reinforcing the need to have traditional owners involved with the decision-making processes right from the beginning, and do it in ways that embraces the right way science approach. And so we're very much reinforcing that message whenever we get the opportunity. And hopefully we will see far more involvement from traditional owners in the early stages. And one thing that has been great that's come out of the fires of the summer has been a recognition of how we learn more about right way fire, and how we are able to, as a broader community, utilize those skills, that knowledge, for traditional owners to do that in southern and southeastern Australia. And we are heavily involved with that in Northern Australia, but how do we actually support traditional owners in the southeast of Australia to do that? Looking at some further questions. One here we've got is in relationship to the dollars that we spend on supporters and fundraising, and people have asked the question that 20% seems to be very high. And it is a high number, and we're working really hard to bring that down. One of the reasons why it is that sort of figure is we have an amazing supporter base of approximately 40,000 people, which means as a supporter base of that size, we need to communicate with them and give those opportunities to engage, and they want to hear the stories. And a lot of our supporter base traditionally have been quite mature in age and prefer a written format. Of course, with the changing that COVID has brought with mail systems and everybody getting more comfortable with these sort of formats, we are constantly looking at how we can convert some of the ways that we used to interact and engage and support our supporters through that fundraising activity to do things in a more electronic way. So I expect, and I'm working really hard, the whole team is, to bring that percentage down over the coming years. But it's great that we've got 40,000 broad range of supporters that we engage with and that we communicate with, which is fantastic. Obviously the last slide has prompted a whole lot of questions. So I'm not sure, Chris, whether we want to share some of these, but one of the questions is our projection, particularly around volunteer revenue, given the recession and the baby boomer retirements. I'll give it a go, but if anybody else, you know, Beck or Chris, you want to jump in on this one. Our volunteers are amazing, and they've kept with us, and we've had people knocking on our door going, when can I get out? When can I get to the reserves? So we expect that there will be a little bit of reduction in activity, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, but not huge. We've got our volunteers back out in South Australia, WA and Queensland. We've had them out at Scottsdale. It's just obviously for Victoria, it's a bit more of a challenge. Chris, this one might be one for you because you've been around the organisation a lot longer than I have. It asks whether the revenues and expenses have changed much over recent years, and whether our mix has changed much over those years.
Thanks, Heather. Yes, I'm happy to answer that. I think I'd make two comments. If people remember as far back as the global financial crisis, funding for not-for-profits fell dramatically. We took that on board as the board of the organisation and decided we should diversify our revenue base for the reasons of encouraging more people to work with us, hence the number of 40-odd thousand, which is, I'm sure, a record number in the conservation space in terms of regular supporters. And we moved more aggressively into related areas of funding. So instead of relying significantly on individual support, we moved to small numbers of dollars per month from a larger number of people. We activated a significantly enhanced program of request monitoring, and we also moved further efforts into working with corporations, whether through donations in kind or money. So for the last 10 years, there's been a significant diversification of our revenue base, which gives me considerable courage in terms of looking forward to what may be more difficult times financially. So the revenue base has changed really quite dramatically over the last decade or so, and to, I think, a significant benefit for the organization. On the expenses side, the numbers haven't changed a lot. We view Bush Heritage as taking our supporters on a journey, not just for a day or a month or a year, but taking them on a journey through their life cycle. So we're happy to work with all demographics to try and encourage further activity as people move through their individual stages of life and have different interests, different requirements, different capacity to support us. So I think, somewhat unlike many other organizations, we work very hard on that, if you like, bonding experience with our supporter base to help ensure the future for the organization. So the dollars spent on conservation have grown substantially, as has the revenue for the organization. Both tracks we want to maintain into the future.
Thanks, Chris. And just picking up on one of the points there, we're a very transparent organisation with how we raise our funds and how we use that. And that's really important to us. It's deeply held within our value system. And that means that we've recently been rated as Australia's best environmental charity that can be donated to with confidence. So that was a company called the Good Cause Company that does those reviews. And it's done purely on what's publicly available. So I think that really recognises the work that we've done to try and be really transparent with exactly how we use the funds, how we raise them, and how we act on our reserves and the things that we do. There is a question about the support we're getting from government. It'd be fair to say that support is relatively small. It tends to be small grants related to specific projects. We are part of the bigger conservation sector that is working together to try and actually get things done on the ground post bushfires and more broadly as we look at a more resilient ecosystem for Australia into the future. But Beck, did you want to add any comments about the sort of the types of government grants we get?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the vast majority of our government support comes through either shared resource deployment across a large geographic area or through grants. Sometimes those grants are not so small, you know, they seem, you know, a couple of $100,000 goes a long way with us. So we make sure that we put that money to good use, both from state governments and from federal governments. But that would be absolutely the vast majority of our conservation funding through the government.
Thanks, Beck. We've got a couple more questions. One relates to whether we're looking at any properties for acquisition of more properties in Victoria, and they're particularly asking about Gippsland. Look, yes, we are looking for more properties to acquire in Victoria, mainly around our existing ones, because then we can leverage the skills and the team that are already there. So at the moment, we're not looking at Gippsland. We believe that there are others that are better placed to actually support the Gippsland community and work in that landscape. So we're more focused around the area of Karakara Wedderburn, so that's Anana, Castlemaine Wedderburn area, and sort of east towards the Hume. So we are still very much looking to, you know, expand our impact with our neighbours, and with that be people who have covenanted land, farmers, those such as state parks and national parks. One more question to go. I think this one's for you, Beck, and this is really asking, what sort of qualities do you look for in researchers and career opportunities that might be available in the conservation science sector? So I know that could be a really big question, but if we can have the short answer.
Yeah. How long have I got?
Yeah, about half a minute.
Well, this is simple. We look for people that are ready to listen, sit, talk with us, have cups of tea, talk with our traditional owners and understand what it is that we need. Fortunately, we have a knowledge strategy. So as I mentioned, all of the knowledge gaps come up from our experts on the ground. They identify knowledge gaps that are really acting as barriers to helping us get that conservation outcome that we're hoping for really across the country. I'm happy to share that with anyone. So if you email me, let me know what your skills and expertise and interest is, and we can talk over the knowledge strategy and see if there's some way that we can work together.
Great, thanks. I'll just round out with the very last question, which was, do we partner sort of outside of Australia? We have many partners around the globe. We don't actively, purchase or manage land overseas, but we have organisations overseas that partner with us, whether it be supporting the work that we do here or that technical exchange, which is really important with how we share with like-minded organisations and build that global support for conservation. But obviously we have a very Australian focus, but if you'd like to explore anything that we've discussed this evening further, then please just drop us an email and we can. I'm just going to hand over in a moment for Chris to round things off, but I'd just like to say a huge thank you from my perspective. I'm sitting here in the Kulin Nations on the edge of Victoria, and so much that I have learnt through my 1 year in bush heritage about the deep respect we have for traditional owners and how much we are learning that is helping us manage the land that we have responsibility for managing and how we work together. So thank you to all of you that have helped this first year for me be such a wonderful journey, and I'm looking forward to heaps more. But over to you, Chris.
So the Bush Heritage vision is healthy country protected forever. That's quite a daunting challenge that we've set for ourselves. But as you can see, we've grown into the task. We've diversified our funding base and expanded our landscape scale work onto land owned by others. We're leveraging our donor funds and our government assistance, and we're underpinned by growing international support and recognition of our capabilities, as well as an award-winning bequest program. Strong underpinnings. So Bush Heritage Australia, as I said, is a good news story. It is making a difference to you and like-minded people. I delight in the thought of leaving an improved natural state to my grandkids and their grandkids, and for their friends and families, and for all Australians. It's a privilege to be on this journey. So many, many thanks for sharing it with us. Good night to all.